Truth.
The Honest Truth met Benito Vergotine.
Smile 90.4 FM.
Joining us this evening on Smile FM to elaborate on what lies ahead beyond the political manifestos of our country's land reform policy is the Chief Executive Officer of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, Peter Setou. Peter, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and good day to your listeners.
What are some of the solutions you feel that can be explored to fast-track the pace of progress in South Africa's land reform program?
The reality is, in South Africa, we are very good at diagnosing the problem, but what we are really not very good at is at implementation, So the challenges that we've got in the land reform are really well known, because there are several reports that have actually been conducted, or reports that are available that really identifies where lies the problem. But to get back to your question, really, we need to balance the manner in which the land is actually acquired and used, because we are usually overly focusing on acquiring the land. But what happens once that land has been transferred remains largely ignored. Hence the failure that we are seeing in land reform. So to address this, we need to make sure that, one, there is sufficient post-settlement support for the beneficiaries of land. We need to support them to ensure that they are able to work the land. We need to increase the resources that are earmarked for support of beneficiaries and ensure that those funds actually reach the intended beneficiaries. We know that land is a very emotive issue. And as a result, we often experience several disputes, particularly the restitution space amongst the beneficiaries of land reform. We need to get a working dispute resolution mechanism to avoid this dragging for ages and impacting on development. I'm sure I'm talking to the converted here. We are aware of, projects where beneficiaries of land reform got their land back, but they can't do anything because they are on each other's throat. They are fighting. And the challenge is there are no robust mechanisms through which disputes could be resolved. We also need to develop innovative financing mechanisms for land reform. The demand by far outstrips available public resources. For us to expect that government would fund everything, we may as well forget about land reform. And to address that, restrictions on access to finance have to be addressed, especially for previously disadvantaged individuals. Relying on grants cannot work, as the government has got budgetary constraints. And the last issue, but not least, really is limited capacity within the state to implement land reform. I think this needs to be addressed as it slows land reform. We need to tap on the goodwill that has been displayed by the private sector, but also we need better coordination amongst the relevant government departments.
Vumelana has been working in the land reform space now for well over a decade. Peter, what are some of the biggest learnings that you are able to share from this experience which we can bring to bear today?
Well, our work as Vumelana bears testimony to the fact that partnership between beneficiaries of land reform and the private sector is actually an immediate way through which we can begin to address some of the challenges that I've alluded to earlier pertaining to land reform. Since our inception 12 years ago, we have supported in excess of 26 community projects, which would attract in excess of R1 billion in private investment, put into productive in excess of 72,000 of land, and positively impact on more than 16,000 or 17,000 households. Now, we need to really replicate this, do it at scale in order to have meaningful impact. We have further projects that are currently under negotiation, which once concluded could generate a further R1 billion in future investment, thus benefiting a whole lot more people. Now, we are saying if we can only replicate this, we will make a dent to the challenges that we are facing. However, it is important to note that to do this, we require financial resources to support the communities. And I believe that the government, the private parties, the donor community can all contribute towards ensuring that organizations such as ourselves can really expand on supporting land reform communities, thus creating much needed jobs and most importantly, to promote social cohesion.
Chief Executive Officer of the Vumelana Advisory Fund joining us, Peter Setou on Smile FM. You're welcome to share your thoughts. What lies ahead for South Africa's land reform beyond political manifestos on 0829 904 904. Peter, how is the Vumelana Fund capitalized?
Well, Vumelana Advisory Fund is a legacy project of the erstwhile Business Trust. During the advent of democracy, big business and government joined hands and contributed a significant amount of money to really drive development. And one of the projects that the Business Trust worked on was in the Bushbuckridge area, which we normally refer to as Mabedi project, where in excess of 2 billion rands worth of private investments were actually mobilized for projects in agriculture and ecotourism space. Now the Business Trust was always meant to be a finite process or project. Now, when the Business Trust closed down, Vumelana got its seed funding from the Business Trust. So this is the kitty that to date we have been really managing very tightly over the last 12 years in order to support communities. But we also do fundraising from the private sector and like-minded companies who are willing to support our work. And that's what has really kept us afloat in order to do what we are doing now.
You mentioned earlier that there's limited capacity within governments to fast-track land reform, and with the added complexity around the very challenging economic environment, how does it impact upon the progress of land reform?
Well, it impacts on land reform in multiple ways. One, it means the limited resources that are available. It means one, land claims cannot be resolved speedily. One, two, there are financial constraints, which means you can only do so much in a particular given financial year because of budgetary constraints. Three, as government, it means you can only, employ so many people, only so many hands on deck, which can actually deal with land reform related aspects. But I think we need to start doing differently, because there's never going to be a situation where we can say there is enough money. We need to leverage on capacity within other government departments which are really involved in this space. We need to make sure that there's much more broader collaboration within or amongst government departments that are involved in land reform more generally. Lastly, our experience, because we tend to work a lot with the private sector, there's a lot of goodwill amongst the private sector to actually partner with government. We really need to harness that relationship. We need to incentivize the private sector so that they can come on board and join hands with government so that we can address the remaining challenges and make land reform actually a success. We need to also make sure that when we do this, we do not leave the communities or the intended beneficiaries, out of the equation. Because, they're saying that nothing about us without us. We need to make sure that we listen to them in terms of what are the challenges that they're facing on the ground. How is it that, how do they see it? How do they think the current challenges could be addressed? Because frequently, sometimes you get a sense that there's more of a top-down approach instead of a really going down to the people and actually saying, we want to listen. What are the challenges? What do you think we can resolve? How can we resolve this? And by doing that, you'll find that there is more coherence. There is more, joining hands with all the stakeholders and role players.
It's incredibly encouraging that there is this goodwill around so many of the stakeholders wanting to collaborate and to create a bigger and better impact within the land reform, and that certainly needs to be encouraged in a range of ways. And you did mention further incentivizing the private sector. From the Vumelana Advisory Fund's point of view, you, what are the thoughts around the expropriation bill? Is it an instrument you feel that can impact upon land reform?
Well, I think one needs to be clear when we're talking about expropriation, what is it that we are talking about? Expropriation has always been part of South African legislation. It predates the new dispensation. The Parliament has currently been working on an expropriation bill, that has been finalized or it has been finalized, which is really intended to bring the existing expropriation law in line with the Constitution. And once finalized, it is expected that this will bring much needed clarity and align the law with the Constitution. For example, to make sure that it cannot be used in an arbitrary manner, that it can be used as a last resort, that it details the procedures that must be followed, and it must provide for recourse through the courts, and that the owner must receive just an equitable amount as compensation. We are aware that one provision that has been inserted in the current bill is a section that deals with expropriation of land without compensation. Now, as you know, this is a highly politically charged debate amongst various role players, in particular political parties. And whilst it is important as South Africans to discuss and talk about these issues, it is important that we must reach finality on these issues, because the more they hang, it creates policy uncertainty, and it has an impact on, investment and attracting investments in the country. So all that we are saying as an organization is that there is a need to finalize this. We expect that if the bill will go ahead and get finalized in its current form, there's a high likelihood that we are likely to see a lot of contestations through the courts where the constitutionality of some of the provisions are being challenged. This is a necessary process so that we can get finality somehow, But all that we are saying is this process must be expedited so that we can have clarity and finality on this issue.
Yeah, clarity is absolutely essential with this regard. I agree with you wholeheartedly there, Peter. Looking ahead, what do you feel needs to be done to further help land reform beneficiaries put their land to productive use?
Simple for me is at a point when you give communities the land. Remember, these are individuals or groups that have been affected by policies of the past and apartheid. At the point when you give them the land, they usually do not have the resources. They usually don't have the technical know-how. They usually don't have the access to market, as an example. So it is important that government has to provide post-settlement support, i.e. provide support to the communities so that when you give them the land, you also provide them with the necessary support so that they are able to work the land. I mean, for me, really, giving communities the land without, the requisite support, it's tantamount to, setting them up for failure. You have to provide them with support. I mean, the issue around access to finance, the issue of access to finance has been around for decades in this country, particularly for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need to, as a country, we need to have a conversation with the broader financial services sector and government and other key role players to say, what is it that needs to be done in order to make sure that South Africans, in particular beneficiaries of land reform, can have access to affordable finance, because relying on government is never really going to help us to get to where we want to get. And as an organization, that's why we are saying partnering with the private sector is an immediate way through which we can address this. But we have to make sure that we address other remaining challenges. As I've said, several reports have been commissioned by government and parliament. For example, the Motlanthe report and the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. They have, identified the issues that needs to be addressed. And we don't have to think we just need to go back to these reports and actually follow the recommendations that have been highlighted or reflected in this report, and make sure that land reform is actually addressed. And some of the issues that have been identified, for example, dealing decisively with corruption and inept communal property association, as well as infightings among the beneficiaries, address insufficient support that's provided to the beneficiaries in the form of resources and skills, as I've said. And in this regard, there's some lessons. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are some lessons that can be learned from what we've done as Vumelana over the last 12 years or so. As I've said, lack of capacity within the state has got to be addressed, and linked to that is better coordination, because if there's better coordination, then the resources can be used quite effectively and in a targeted manner. But also poor monitoring and evaluation. We need to make sure that we set realistic targets and actually monitor and evaluate whatever that we set out to do. And there must be, consequences in instances where we say we do this and certain things were not done, not because it was an impossibility, but because people simply didn't do what they were supposed to do. I think there has to be consequences. In that way, we'll start seeing some progress in addressing some of these challenges.
Lastly, Peter, land reform, as you mentioned earlier, is a hot political issue and unsurprisingly has emerged as one of the features of a range of manifestos for political parties contesting the upcoming provincial and national elections on the 29th of May. Do you feel that they are taking advantage of the gaps in land reform program, or is there an accurate assessment of what needs to be tackled?
I cannot really say much about what political parties are saying with regard to, land. I mean, it is an emotive issue, which is why you see most of the political parties, especially the bigger ones, all of them, they've got something on land reform, etc., precisely because it's a critical issue. But I think beyond just politicking, beyond just trying to canvass for votes, we need to get down to business as South Africans after the elections and start in earnest dealing with the identified challenges to make sure that land reform can work. We are doing this at our own peril, because if there's one thing, in my view, that would have an impact on social cohesion is land reform. If we don't address it, very soon we'll have challenges in our hands, because people are going to rise and actually say government has actually failed. And if government has failed and if people start taking it to the streets, it's not only government that's going to suffer. Everybody's going to suffer. The private sector is going to suffer. It is important that we must have social cohesion. It's one thing to talk about these issues in public platforms, but I think once the dust has settled, we need to get down to business in earnest and make sure that land reform works.
Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, Peter Setou, as always, appreciates your considered insights and opinion around these matters. Peter, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Smile.
It makes you feel good.
90.4 FM.